Hey, Matt here with Words First Marketing, where we have conversations with certified Storybrand guides about how different folks can implement Storybrand and other marketing practices for their own businesses. And today I am talking with Annie Schiffman about how to implement Storybrand if you are a creative person. That could be maybe you're a solo artist or creative, or maybe you're working in a creative industry or firm or something. But there's some specific things that we want to talk about when it comes to creatives and how they would implement good marketing. Annie, why don't we start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, why you like to work with creatives, and anything else that you want to tell us here at the top.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, so much for having me here on Words First. I love this opportunity to be able to talk about the creative life with people, because I feel so often that nowadays we're talking more about how, earning a living and having a life in the creative field. And, I'm in my early 40s, and it just seemed like a couple of, a decade or two ago, like that was just not in the conversation. So I'm really glad that we can be having this. And part of what got me involved with marketing initially for the performing arts, and then for the arts, and then just for creatives in general, as time has gone on, is that for a long time, I was a professional actress. I traveled the world. I did improv comedy shows mostly. I would get on stage with a group of other people, and we would do a 90-minute, 2-hour show. And I would have no idea before it started what it was going to be. Mm. And I traveled all over the world, and then started speaking to companies about how they could harness that creative energy, how they could use it, how they could get off their sales scripts. And I started doing a lot of facilitating. And one gig that I had was when there was this new thing called Twitter that was just starting. And the keynote speaker for this big meeting for this big tech company was talking about how you can use this new thing called Twitter to help your business. And I was backstage and I was like, guys, I think we could get other people to come to our show if we start to use this. And so that's how I just started learning about initially social media marketing. Mm-hmm. And then that led to email marketing and messaging. And then when I read Building a Story Brand, it was so innate with what I already understood, because I was so familiar with narrative structure. We had to learn that for our improv shows. So that way, when we created shows on the spot, they had a structure that the audience already inherently knew. And so then when I could switch that around to marketing, that made a lot of sense. And I started really learning about social media. And I had friends who were like, oh, I've got a book coming out. Somebody said, oh, I've got a new show that I'm going to put out downtown. Can you help me use social for it? Or my show is a touring company, or all this kind of stuff. So then I realized I could advise, or I could execute for brands in the arts, this kind of marketing stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I just realized I wanted a little bit more control over my life.
Yeah.
The creative life gives you. So that's how I made that adjustment. But I was like, yeah, I want to help. These are the people that I get it. I've lived it. I'm married to an artist. Like, I just get it, the whole deal.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people might not know this. I have a background in fine arts. I studied conceptual installation sculpture when I was in university. And the way I explain it is basically, if you've ever gone into a modern art museum and you see something that you don't understand and makes you a little bit angry, that's probably the sort of art that I created. And all that to say is, creatives.
I love your work.
I love it too. And there's not a whole lot of people in the world who are making, a really great living doing that kind of art. I love the idea of it, and there's still a place in my heart, but I'm really happy also to be in marketing now. Yep. And, the biggest thing I got from art school that I still use is critique. There's a lot of looking at things, understanding what you're trying to communicate, and then figuring out what's working and what's not. It's very similar to what we would do, in a critique in the arts. Creatives are special people.
Yes, tell them that a lot. They need to hear that a lot, Matt.
Yeah, and it takes, I mean, it takes a certain personality, I think, or drive to be in the arts and to be a creative. There's also some things that I feel like a lot of creatives struggle with when trying to shift their brains from like, I am creating something and my craft, to being like, I need to now promote it and market it to the masses. And there's actually, I think, kind of a line that is very difficult for creatives to jump over, because it feels almost like a betrayal of their craft. What's your advice for creatives when they're thinking about marketing themselves or their projects?
Well, I think a big starting point is the mindset shift. We have been told our whole lives as artists that we are probably like the whole starving artist thing, right? So there's already this ingrained part of us that hears like, you're not going to make a living, or the real artists don't make a living, or they just do it for the art. And it's like, no, it's okay. Like you're allowed to have a nice house, and it's okay if you're paying your mortgage and that you have to, have health insurance. Like it's okay to do all of those things while at the same time being an artist. And so I think that's the first hurdle that a lot of artists need to get over, which is just, you can earn a living as an artist. Just boom, that right there is a big deal. And then also that your work deserves to be seen. If you are at a point where you have devoted your life to this, my guess is you're probably at a certain caliber of talent. And my guess is that your work deserves, I know that your work deserves to be seen. And many times artists are like, I don't know, like, if I can just get 10 people there to the show, or if I can just, if I can just finish it, then I will be happy. And it's like, no, people want to support the work that you do. And so I think that's also a part of it. And then a lot of what I'll talk about in terms of when I'm working with creatives, in terms of like just getting email addresses and stuff like that, is give people the opportunity to see your work again. Just not that it's like, okay, they went to that one show, or they heard you that one time, or they checked out your stuff that one time. But as your work evolves, they want to continue to support you. Everyone loves anyone who has saw Hamilton off Broadway makes a very big point to say that they saw Hamilton off Broadway. And people want to do that with other artists as well, right? They want to support your work when it's in the newer phases, and they want to keep supporting it as it adjusts. So just know you can make a living, your work deserves to be seen, and give people the opportunity to see it.
On like a tactical level, what are the most important sort of starting places? What are the key areas that artists, I mean, the arts, creatives, is a broad category, so it's a little different, depending on what your specific circumstances are. But where would you usually tell a creative to focus their energy when it comes to getting their work seen and kind of building a marketing strategy for themselves?
Yeah, well, so when I work with photographers or dramatists or musicians or authors, because we all have had social media for about 10 years at least, it's been very easy for artists because they can come up with something and they can put it right out there right away. And so then tactically, what I often need to steer artists and creatives in the direction of is, remember, algorithms are volatile. So that can change. So make sure then that you're still building up your audience outside of social media platforms. So then that means that you want to make sure that you are collecting email addresses. And so a lot of times people will say, oh, well, at the show that I did, I'll just make sure that, when people bought tickets, that I just get those names. And I'll say, yes, you want to make sure you get those names and email addresses. But remember, Jan from the church group may have bought tickets for 15 of her friends for them all to go for the Saturday matinee. That means that 15 people were in those seats, but you only got one email address. So I'll oftentimes say, make sure that you're getting email addresses and don't rely on social. So those I think are really big things. You can use social media strategically, but but if you've only got an hour to work on marketing your stuff, work on whatever is going to get the email address versus on what's going to get your stuff out there.
Yeah. And despite email being older than social media, I think most of the data still says that it's a more effective channel when it comes to getting people to actually make decisions and purchases. And so if you're showing up in their social media feed, it's much easier to scroll by, or people tend to scroll by faster. If it's in the email, you tend to have a better chance of them actually clicking that link to make a purchase.
Well, also, so I'm certified in, there's only a handful of us. I'm certified in MailChimp and in Storybrand. There's only a handful of us that are certified in both. And, you know, a huge difference is not only how effective one is versus the other, but, you know, your traditional Facebook page, it's only, when you put out a post, the average that's going to get in front of is 3% of your audience, 3%. Yeah. So you put out the post, you're not even sure it's going to get to them. Now, could you imagine if you put out an email and the deliverability rate was only 3%? I've never seen a deliverability rate that's lower than 90%. Now, granted, the open rate may not necessarily be that, but I'm just saying the opportunity for the stuff to get in front of someone is so much lower on social than it is on email, that just as far as how, and again, I will talk about your time spent versus the bang for your buck, because many times those in the creative industries don't have as much money because, you know, it's an arts nonprofit, or it's, you know, it's a one-person show. And I mean that like metaphorically, like it's just one person running their whole brand or whatever. So many times funds are lower, but they may have a little bit more time, or they need to be more scrappy with their time. So just looking at that, I feel that email is very important, just given how volatile that, and Facebook, I just read a whole bunch of changes this morning that Facebook and well, that Meta is making for Facebook and Instagram. So just changing all the time. Email just doesn't change that fast.
Yeah. Well, and it allows you to pivot too, right? I think a lot of creatives built their audience on Instagram, and then along came Patreon. And so now they want to get people from Instagram to Patreon, as you know, to build up more maybe direct support, sales, whatever it is. If you have an email list, you're able to more easily kind of direct and try to move that audience between places. You don't have to, because you more or less own that list. You can even take that list from MailChimp and, you know, put it in somewhere else. It's yours. It doesn't belong to the platform, you know, your followers on Instagram. You can't export that list, right?
Right.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk specifically about Storybrand. So Storybrand, typically it's marketed for businesses. Most creatives and artists are, you know, businesses. That's if they're, maybe it's a hobby, but really like, you know, a serious artist, they're making their living off of that. And so they're a single person business. A big piece of the Storybrand framework, kind of the core idea, is that you should position your audience as the hero and yourself as the guide. And that is super powerful for so many small businesses. It's this paradigm shift that they really need to make. I think it gets a little more complicated though, often when you're talking about an artist or a creative, because in a lot of ways, let's talk about a musician. They kind of are the product. They're not just the company behind the product where they can be the guide, but they're the product themselves. And so what kind of advice would you give to a creative person who, you know, loves the idea of Storybrand and being clear in their messaging, but isn't sure how to position themselves as a guide or where they fit into that story?
Yeah, so it definitely requires a little bit of nuance. And that's why when there is a Storybrand marketing live stream, I like to make sure that I have a cohort of people that are mostly in the arts, because of those adjustments that need to be made. First of all, I'm going to talk about the similarities. Part of the similarities, you want to make sure that you are all, you know, the Storybrand framework makes it very important that you have a call to action, that you have, whether it's direct or it's transitional, that you have a plan where you just sort of explain to people, here's how you get tickets, or here's how you come to the concert, or here's how you can download my most recent album. So you got to do this, and then you'll do this, and then you get to listen to it. So that kind of stuff is the same. That's really important. But yes, it does require a little bit of nuance right up off the top. So if you're thinking things like, yeah, what is the problem that you're solving? Well, maybe you can just say, when I was creating this album, I was going through this at the time. These were some of the problems I was working towards, and I needed this music to help me get out on the other side of it. So if you've ever felt that way, this is going to be a helpful thing for you. So I think that you can honor the fact that there is a little bit more nuance involved, and that's okay, but still recognize what your audience's journey is, that they're trying to figure out, is this for me? Is this the kind of stuff I'm going to like? And then does this person know what they're talking about? Like, as far as the guide thing, like, well, do you really know? Like, are you just like, what kind of a musician are you? When you say to me that I've performed in, not only have I been to every state, but I've performed in every state, it's like, oh, wow, okay, this guy's actually got some credentials. Okay, cool. And then you say things like, and here's how you can listen to my album, do that today. This is how it's going to make you feel, or this is how a lot of other people have felt, or blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff still applies, even if you do need to call attention to yourself at certain moments in the marketing messaging that you're bringing about.
Yeah, I often think about it as you're both the guide, but you're also in some ways like an avatar for your audience. And so you're the type of guide that is just, you understand them because you are them, or you were them, or you're the person that they want to become. And so by the way that you talk about your own story, your goal is to make sure that you're talking about it in a way that's really relatable to the people that you're working with.
Yes.
Right. I think that, this is obviously really big, but I think when we're talking about musicians, an artist who's done a really great job at this is Taylor Swift. I think she's a marketing genius, maybe more so than an amazing, she's probably a great musician, but I think that her ability to elevate her audience and kind of get her audience to feel like they're walking the same path as her. You see how she's kind of adapted and changed as her audience has gotten older. The themes and the things that she's focused on matches where they're at. She's not kind of stuck in that same place. I think she does a great job of that.
I agree. I think it's when you can see the artists connecting, or just, the creative. So I was working with a photographer, and so she was trying to, mostly does newborn stuff. And so a lot of the work that we did, and I was advising her with her social media strategy, was saying like, all right, what are some of the obstacles that new parents have? And they think like they're going to have to be polished. And when you have a newborn, that is the last way that you are feeling, like all of these different things. And it's just meeting your audience where they're at and saying like, yeah, I mean, in the Storybrand framework, this is the guide part, and specifically the empathy part of that. Like, I get it. But I promise you that when you do have me show up there, I've done this hundreds of times before, and I'm going to make sure that these pictures come out and reflect your family and where your family is right now.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing that you can always say, like, I'm going to be the one there, or this is my work, or this is my art, and this kind of a thing. But then every so often it's just saying, I like to say too, I live 30 miles west of Manhattan, right? So a lot of times I get invited to go see shows in New York City, whether it's musicians, improvisers, comedians, whatever it is, theater. And so if you invite me to a show in February in New York City, I've got to be assured it's going to be good, because not only am I coming in from Jersey, and not only do I have to get a babysitter, but I might very well have to deal with a snowstorm or an ice storm and all of this stuff. You need to let me know in your marketing that, Annie, this is going to be worth it. Here's what we are doing to make this worth your time. We're going to have this cast of people, or this comedian just performed at this festival, the sold out crowds, or we're going to make sure that it's a very simple process with COVID protocols, like whatever that stuff is. It's the difference between come see my show, come see my art, come see my thing, versus here's how we're going to take care of you. So when you do step outside your house, or when you do take in the work that we're doing, you are set up for success. And it's just flipping that around.
I think if there's one thing that just a thing for creatives to think about when they're doing their own promotion and social media is most musician, artist, creative promotion is come to my show. It's like all call to action and no empathy, no plan, no process. And so if you look at those different pieces of the Storybrand framework and start to build out, what do you say in some of these other buckets, that can just help kind of round out what it is that you're communicating to your audience.
Exactly. So for example, I was working with an improv show in New York City, and they make a point that the first half of their show is like an awards show. So the performers are in tuxedos, they're in formal wear. This is very different than if you saw a more downtown improv group where it's just a bunch of people took a class together and now all of a sudden they're doing their class show, right? But as the audience member, I want to know that. So they make it very clear, look, we know a lot of improv shows aren't always polished and may have more of a laid back vibe. When you are ready for something that is more grown up, or I don't exactly remember like the words a while ago, but it was just basically, we just said like, this is what the situation oftentimes is. And we are not that. This is who we are. So it's bringing up what the problem is with many other types of that art form, or, like we're not a stuffy museum, or we are not, out for those family portraits that you would see at JCPenney, right? Like whatever all the different thing is, it's bringing that up, and it's just so much more than come see my show, because that's just sort of oh, that's nice. You're doing a show. I'm so happy for you that you're doing this thing that fulfills your life.
That kind of leads to another point. I think that a lot of creatives operate in this mindset that the work should speak for itself. I shouldn't have to define it. I shouldn't have to tell people about it. They should just experience it. And then if they like it, they're going to tell their friends. And I think my response is that is a wonderful fairy tale world that that we all would love to live in, but it's not the reality of what works for most people, because most people aren't artists.
I mean, that's the business. Think about, Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio, they have to do press junkets, right? Like that's just part of the gig. Part of the gig is that when you have to consider when you are launching something, or when you have a show going up, or when you have a project going out, you have to consider what is happening in the lead up to it. And then what is the execution of it? And then what is happening in the wake of that? So, so when Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio were doing, what was that film that they did a few years ago, the Quentin Tarantino film? Anyway,
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yes. So like even that, right? Like they obviously the lead up to it was they had to do all this stuff ahead of time to announce it, and then they filmed it, and then what happens afterwards? They've got to go on press junket after press junket for days and days and days, interview after interview after interview. That's the game. That's part of it. And if you want to be a artist or a creative with a viable business, then you have to decide how much of a hand you want in that. And if you want your revenue to increase, then you either have to pay somebody else to do it, or you do it yourself. But it has to be done if you want to make the money from it, if you want people to give you money for it, because it's a business. You're lucky that it's a business doing something that you are so passionate and so talented in. Nonetheless, it's a business. So you have to think about it that way.
So I have another friend, he's a Storybrand guide, works primarily with photographers. And we were having a conversation about how the photographers he knows tend to, when business is hard, they lean back on the thing that they know, which is photography. And so when they're not getting the number of customers, clients that they want, what goes through their head is like, oh, I need a better portfolio, or I need another camera lens. And so they put their time into things like equipment and craft, when really they're already at the level that they need to be at. Not that you should ever stop improving your craft, but they get distracted thinking the missing piece here is something that has to do with my work or myself. And really the missing piece has to do with marketing, promotion, and like business model type things.
Yeah. Well, on a similar vein, I facilitated a couple of years back at TwitchCon. So this was, and I was leading the discussion in the room of the people who were streaming. So, on Twitch, you get paid to stream mostly video games. And so these were the people who were making at least 6 figures streaming. And there was actually a mental health expert on there, because they oftentimes, the streamers would think like, oh, well, if I stream for 8 hours a day versus 7 hours a day, that's another hour. I can get more sponsorships. I can make more money, blah, blah, blah. And it's very tricky when you get paid to do this thing that you love, because then it's hard to know when to stop doing the thing that you love and start focusing on the things that get it paid, and vice versa. And so it's kind of realizing, what is the time that you're doing because you're doing it for your career, and what is the time that you're doing it because you just love it and you just want to do that. And that might have to happen for, like, I was talking to a children's book author, and he wanted to sell more books. So he's like, I need to write more books. It's like, no, you don't need to write more books. You just need to market the books that you've already written better. If you want to do more writing, great. Just know that's creative time. That's soul fulfilling time. That's important time that you need to build into your day so you can lead a more purposeful life. And that's great. But if you've only got an hour and you need to sell more stuff, market that stuff better, and then carve out another hour to just do writing for the sake of writing, or for these streamers just to play the video game for the sake of the video game.
There's that balance between, I've met a lot of creatives who could use their talents to make more money, but it would take away from their ability to create the craft that they want. So like a writer who could do a great job copywriting for SaaS companies doesn't want to put his creative energy into writing for SaaS companies, because it would make it harder. It would make him not love the writing that he wants to do. And I know that's sometimes a decision that creatives make, but kind of in that vein, sometimes your art like butts up against something else that you can bring to the table that's really valuable, that people really need. So kind of going back to the wedding photographer, and you want to create content, and you want to, write about, big content that's going to help your business. Your content should be focused on weddings, not on photography, because you're not selling, you're not teaching people how to take better pictures. You have an expertise that is related to weddings. You've seen a lot of them, you know what looks good, you can see the trends, you can talk all about that. And it's not really your craft exactly, but it's going to help support your business as well. That's another way to be a guide, I guess, is, without it being about like, I don't have to teach people to play guitar or paint, to be their guide. I can find a kind of a sideways way into that.
Yeah, for sure. And and recognizing that, I think is so important. And it's just part of that whole overall mind shift, which is you are allowed to be a working artist that makes money. And there is a difference between being a starving artist and being a multimillionaire, right? There is a place in there where you can live you can have a nice living, you can support yourself and your family doing the things that you love to do. And a lot of times it's just, and also something I really like about the Storybrand funnel too, is that when you get that going, you've got your messaging set up, you've got your website set up, your lead generators on there, it gets the automated emails going out. That I just like that, because then that frees up time. That puts your marketing stuff on autopilot. So that way that frees up time for you to do the thing, and for you to be meeting with the people, or for you to be making more music, or like whatever it is. Like, that's something I really like about sales funnels in general. Like, just, I know that you're a creative, delicate flower, and you are so different than everyone else, but just get that kind of like, just take a couple of weeks to either like work with a Storybrand guide, or work through the courses in Business Made Simple, like whatever it is that you need to do to get that done. Take that time, so that way that's done. That element of it is completed. And now you could focus on some other stuff.
One thing actually I would say an advantage that creatives often have is that, so I'm a little bit cynical about the like downloadable lead gen strategy these days,
Oh,
but
yeah.
creatives have the best content, like the best
Yes.
lead generator possible. They've already been creating something that's very valuable that people want, that they can offer for free or put in places where they can get that email address. So it's a huge advantage. That, I mean, the biggest problem with the downloadable PDF in most cases is that it's not valuable enough anymore for people to give you their email address. But in the creative space, I think a lot of times they already have something that is a lot more compelling that they could use.
And exactly. And it's not a PDF. I've worked with clients where they will give you a link to a specific playlist of videos or playlists of songs. They've created their own EP that's just for, it's basically their lead gen thing. I worked with a company where when that audience, so again, it was an improv show. And so when audiences would come in, when they got their email, they would get a recording. They would get the cast album from that show that would happen that night. And that show would never happen again. So if it was your suggestion or like that was around you, and like that synergy that you felt that night, that was only going to happen then. So not only was that another revenue stream for them, because I know what it was. You would get one free song for your email, and then you could buy the whole cast album. That's what it was. Boom. That helped to double their email list so fast. And not only that, then every time they went to those different towns, then they could send out an email 3 weeks ahead of time, 20, I forget, I think like 50 miles around that zip code and say, hey, we're back in your town again. And they built up their email list so fast from doing things like that. But creative people are creative. So that's why you could come up with really great lead generators. Do not put out the 7 reasons why your wedding photographers, blah, blah, blah. No, you can get more creative with that then.
Yeah.
And you can do that. I mean, done is better than perfect. So if you can bang that out and get done, fine. But my guess is you probably have better stuff that you could do.
Yeah.
And I love to do that with clients. I love coming up with that stuff. What are some other fun ones that you've seen? Creative space.
I don't know if it's all lead generators. I know, I've talked with a couple of musicians who are using Patreon. It's not the same as an email list, but it's a similar thing. And so building in some of the incentives that they've got on Patreon, touring musicians, giving away, basically saying, I'll have 3 people I can put on the list in every town. And so if you first come, first serve, if you're a Patreon member, you can ask to be put on the list when we're traveling. Just these various incentives to make people want to be in your database, I think is really important. And creatives, they have the best stuff when it comes to that. I work with a lot of accounting firms. They don't have anything nearly as compelling as like an EP that you recorded just for your, biggest fans.
Yeah. And they can't and many times when your world is not putting out stuff all the time, it is like the idea of saying to somebody, okay, well, can you make a 5-minute video about blah, blah, blah? Like, maybe somebody in an accounting firm would be like, oh God. But you say that to a group of performers and they're like, do you need that like now? When do you want us to do that? And they will have it done so fast. So I mean, creatives create, like let them be creative and create. And that's just so important, I think. And that's why the framework is nice, because then you're able to have like, but I don't want to forget, this is how you actually get the thing. So don't forget to do this and then this and then this so you can get it. And, make sure you have that call to action in there, or make sure that you share. If you were just in the press, that's part of your authority for the guide section of things. So make sure that you include that. If you were on a podcast, like all of that kind of stuff, like use those sorts of things. I often find that creatives would be like, oh yeah, I did this really cool radio interview when I was in Seattle a couple of weeks ago. It's like, well, get it. Put it somewhere. Let's use it. That's helpful.
Yeah.
So
we've kind of danced around this a little bit, but I think that, and again, I think,
dancers, we could even,
I think it's, it's true. It's true for every business owner. I have this theory that like running a business is only 30% being good at the thing that you're good at. And then it's like 70% figuring out all of these things that you never thought you needed to know about, like how to run the business side of things. And I think that's especially true. I went to art school. No one ever talked about how to run a business as an artist. It was all about,
same thing with me.
Yeah, it was all about, craft and painting, and I loved it, but there's so much to learn on the other side. Now, I'm going to paint with a really broad brush here, but what I've found is that a lot of creatives, it's kind of a mindset thing, but they tend to like shy away from wanting to be too clear about what they're doing because it feels either salesy or it doesn't feel authentic or it's not interesting enough. They'd rather have like kind of cryptic, funny posts about their upcoming show than something that's like really direct. Is that something that you've seen? And if so, what's kind of your advice?
Yeah, I have seen that a lot, that or just that I have a show coming up. It's so great that I have a show. I am so humbled that I have a show, stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I just think that all goes back to the mindset of not wanting to, either not wanting to or adjusting the mindset of just realizing like, yeah, this is if I want to make a living, I have to do a business, and you don't have to work for a company. You can work for yourself, and the business can be that the creative work that you're doing, but there's still elements of being a business person. I mean, I'm sure that a ton of people, everyone listening to this podcast right now knows somebody who is ridiculously talented, who is not famous. And a lot of that might just be because the elements of getting, not even famous, but I mean, just like being a working artist. And a lot of those elements, they just either didn't want to, or didn't have the skills, or didn't even know that they needed to do that. And it's, I mean, I think that's why it's great that you're having an episode of your podcast like this, right? Because I was the same thing. I went to NYU, Tisch School of the Arts, graduated in 2001. And there was no conversation about what do you do when you get a gig that pays you $8K all at once and you don't work again for another 7 months. How are you going to make that work? How are you going to invoice them to make sure that you get that $8K that they told you they were going to give you? If you're not in the union and you don't have reps that can advocate for you, or you don't have agents that can advocate for you, like how do you make all that stuff work? And I'm a huge proponent, by the way, of Mike Michalowicz's Profit First. Huge proponent of that, especially if you're doing like a Kickstarter, or if you're doing something where you're going to have an influx of cash all at once. Or I also like it because in that book, he talks about not only how to allocate revenue that comes in, but how often, so if you've got a whole bunch of people that are all putting in time and a little bit of money, and you're like, yeah, like we're all going to benefit from this eventually, like we're all co-producers on this, or we're all working on this project together, you're going to find that unless you start really paying people, best intentions, they're just not going to stay for very long. And Profit First helps you talk about how you can distribute dividends. So that way, when you have people who are working on, even though it's not a lot of money, but anyone who's gotten a royalty check knows, even if you've gotten a royalty check for like $1.50, and you're like, yes, $1.50. I'm willing to put in a little bit more time to do this project that just paid me $1.50 in royalties. And it's the same way when you have co-producers and you've got, all of this kind of stuff. Like you want to make sure that you are able to run it like a business, and not just like, okay, well, we got all this money that came in from this Kickstarter, and, we ran through it so fast. Now there's no money left for any of us to actually get paid on it. So, I mean, it's good that we put it into the company, but soon a lot of people who were involved in the first place are going to drop out. So I really like the book Profit First. It's going to be hard for you to read it as a creative because you'll think this does not apply to me, but it does.
Are there any other resources, podcast, books, things that you really love for creative people that you would recommend?
Yes, I feel like part of what I've done since I've been involved in marketing for the past 8 years is basically reading business books and filtering them through the lens of the arts. Yeah. So I think that there's, and that's one of the reasons why Storybrand made so much sense. As I said at the beginning, I really like Never Lose a Customer Again by Joey Coleman, because an important part of being a creative is oftentimes working with the people who believe in you over and over again. And you want to make sure that you can actually honor them in some ways. And there are ways that you can gift them that just says, thanks for hiring me for this gig. Thanks for thinking of me for this corporate thing. I'm really glad I could do this for you. And just starting to think of yourself like more of a business than you would. And I would say that's another book that I'm looking on my bookshelf now of other books that I recommend for artists to read. They Ask You Answer is another great one, which is basically all about how do you come up with content that answers questions that your audience is often asking. So if you were, Matt, like doing your sculpture, and, people might ask, well, what even is this kind of sculpture? That's an easy blog post that you could create right there, which just helps people understand a little bit more about the work that you do and the process that you do it. So that way they'll want to work with you or want to come and see your work or want to hire you to do that work for them.
Yeah, I think creatives really could benefit a lot from giving people a little bit more like entry points, kind of behind the scenes, like understanding what's behind their craft is, I think, a really great way to build that. It's kind of in line with that like 1,000 true fans model. Like try to get 1,000 true fans, not 100,000 weak tie type fans. I'll throw another resource out there. I'm a big fan of Creative Pep Talk. It's a podcast. Andy J. Pizza is his name, and he is always talking about habits and different ways that creatives can kind of think about how to turn their craft into a business. So that's a good one. I've been taking some notes. So just a couple of takeaways from our conversation today that I think I picked up on. One, I mean, we frame it around Storybrand. That's kind of where we start, but especially for creatives, there's so much that's just built into, I think, thinking about yourself as a business and getting over that mindset hurdle of saying it's okay to market yourself. It's something that you should be doing. It's like having that mindset of you deserve to be, to make money doing this, to feed your family and have health insurance. And then if you can get over that mindset, then you can start thinking about like, okay, now how do I do this a little more strategically to be really effective in it? But if you're not there yet, like you got to deal with that head stuff before you can even think about the tactical marketing things. And then, you mentioned earlier, the plan. I think that if there's one piece of the Storybrand framework that artists could really easily implement that would probably really benefit them would be to think about, how do I include a plan of action? How do you get tickets for the show? How do you come see it? How do you buy the album? Like those sorts of things could really pay big dividends. And then my third one, if you're looking at your brand script as a creative, really pay attention to that empathy section, because your ability to connect at a personal level with your audience is one of the really key pieces of success for most creatives. And in the Storybrand framework, empathy is sort of the core, box that we put that in. Any other kind of final thoughts or things that you want to sort of re-emphasize, or maybe anything that we didn't talk about today that's important?
Yeah, well, I did just think of another resource that I really like, which is The Tilt by Joe Polizzi. A lot of times his stuff is geared towards content creators. So if you have a YouTube channel or whatever, but obviously there's so much overlap there with just creatives. So for sure, check out The Tilt. But just remember, your work deserves to be seen, and allow people to have the opportunity to watch your work change and grow and adapt. It's going to, over time, allow people to do that, because if they've already raised their hand and said, I'm interested in you, I'm interested in the work that you do, I'm interested in the stuff that you put out, allow them to experience it again.
Well, and I mean, to put a real fine point on that, that means build your email list. Like that's the number, the number one thing is let them see you again. And the best way to do that is to build your email list, figure out a way to have that as part of your strategy at every show or every time you promote things online. This is great. This was a really fun conversation. Annie, where can people find you, or how can they connect with you?
So you can always go to downstage.media. That's one place where you can find, I have a lot of blog content up there, which will oftentimes filter things through the lens of the arts. And then I would love to connect with you on Twitter. So you can find me at Annie Schiff. Schiffman is too long. It's all too long. So it's ANNIE, obviously, and then SCHIFF. So at Annie Schiff. Find me there. I spend too much time there. And yeah, and I look forward to chatting with you all soon. I want to see your work. So if you heard me on this podcast, please let me know. I would love to check out the work that you are doing.
That's great. Well, I'm Matt Banker. My company is called Banker Creative. We build Storybrand websites for all kinds of different businesses. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so I'd suggest if you want to connect with me, find me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter too, but I'm more of a lurker. I'm a scroller, not as active there. So bankercreative.com or find me on LinkedIn, and we'll see you next time on Words First Marketing. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.